It all started on an unusually hot Tuesday afternoon, the kind where even the cicadas seemed too exhausted to sing, when I heard the familiar rattle of the delivery truck pulling up to my driveway, a sound that normally meant nothing more than another gadget or part for my vintage restoration hobby. But this time was different. This time it was the culmination of over 6 months of coordination with a rare materials supplier in northern Finland. A delicate handoff involving cryo-transport, a bonded courier, and enough insurance paperwork to choke an entire law firm, because what was being delivered wasn't just rare, it was one of a kind. A custom alloy blend of scandium and titanium processed with ancient metallurgical techniques only a handful of surviving practitioners knew how to execute, ordered at great personal cost to help me complete a bespoke restoration for a 1964 Shelby Daytona coupe that would be unveiled at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance in just under 3 months. And if the parts didn't arrive in mint, uncontaminated condition, the entire project, sponsorship deals, and years of credibility would go up in smoke. But of course none of that mattered to Karen, our local HOA enforcer with the charm of a soggy wasp and the moral flexibility of a pit viper, who had long appointed herself the self-righteous guardian of our neighborhood's perceived purity, obsessing over mailbox colors, trash can placements, and the exact length of everyone's lawn to the millimeter. A woman who wielded laminated violation slips like sacred texts and carried her bleach spray bottle like a holy relic, ready to banish any perceived impurity she spotted on her sacred sidewalks. And on this particular Tuesday, that unholy crusade collided disastrously with my delivery. Because while I had instructed the courier to leave the package in a specially marked, thermally insulated container beside my garage, complete with "Do not touch," "Do not expose to light," and extremely fragile stickers in bold red, Karen, whose house sat diagonally across from mine, had apparently been watching with her binoculars. Yes, she kept binoculars by her front window, and within minutes of the delivery driver pulling away, she had marched across the street in her pastel tracksuit, bleach bottle in hand, muttering about contaminants and illegal drops, and with a zeal rivaling a televangelist on a donation spree, she proceeded to hose down the clearly marked container with industrial-strength bleach, thinking she was sanitizing the neighborhood from whatever foreign threat she imagined I had received, utterly unaware that the container wasn't just protecting a package, it was part of the containment protocol to preserve the integrity of the metal inside, which instantly reacted with the chlorine, causing irreversible corrosion and deactivation of the alloy, a chemical chain reaction that turned my $280,000 order into a bubbling, discolored, unusable mess, which I discovered only hours later when I returned from picking up additional tools, and upon opening the container and catching a whiff of bleach mixed with scorched titanium, my heart nearly stopped. Not only had the material been ruined, but the supplier had explicitly warned that, once compromised, the process could not be duplicated or replaced, as the artisan involved was elderly and had already declared retirement following this final commission, meaning my one and only shot at completing the Shelby project for Pebble Beach was gone, along with the endorsements, media exposure, and contractual bonuses riding on its success. And that's when the rage hit, not just anger, but a bone-deep fury that years of work had been undone by a nosy neighbor with a god complex and a spray bottle. And so I stormed across the street, knocked so hard on her door I thought the frame might give. And when she answered with her usual saccharine smile and that grating tone she used when pretending to be the voice of reason, she tried to lecture me about unauthorized deliveries, claiming my package looked suspicious, and she had to take action for the safety of the community. But when I showed her the documentation, the tracking, the marked warnings, and the photographic evidence of her dousing the container, captured by my doorbell cam in glorious HD, she didn't apologize. She scoffed, rolled her eyes, and said, "Well, maybe next time label it better." And that's when I realized this wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate, malicious sabotage, wrapped in a blanket of faux concern. And so I did the only thing left. I lawyered up, and not just any lawyer, but the top civil litigation attorney in the state, a friend of a friend who specialized in HOA-related abuses, someone who had sued entire boards into oblivion and had a particular disdain for suburban tyrants. And together, we filed suit not just against Karen personally for property damage and interference with contractual obligations, but against the HOA as an entity for failing to rein in her behavior despite numerous prior complaints from residents, most of which had been dismissed or buried by Karen herself, who also sat on the board. And as the legal wheels began to turn, the scope of Karen's overreach began to unravel. Depositions revealed she had altered complaint records, falsified neighborhood incident logs, and even threatened other residents into silence under the guise of compliance, all while using HOA funds to cover her own landscaping and maintenance bills, essentially running a small dictatorship under the pretense of community stewardship. But it wasn't until the expert valuation of the ruined delivery came in, confirming not only the monetary loss, but the potential revenue and reputational damages tied to the undelivered restoration, that the case exploded in scale, shifting from a simple neighborly dispute to a full-blown multi-million-dollar civil suit with national press coverage. And suddenly Karen's smug smile started to crack. As reporters camped outside her house, local news ran segments titled Bleachgate, and other residents began to come forward, emboldened by my lawsuit, sharing their own horror stories of harassed guests, fines for sidewalk chalk, and backyard inspections while they were at work, all leading to a special emergency HOA meeting where a quorum was finally reached to remove Karen from her board position, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. But even as her power waned and her lawyer attempted to negotiate a quiet settlement, I refused to back down, not after what she'd cost me. And as discovery expanded, we uncovered even more damning evidence. Karen had ignored multiple cease-and-desist warnings from a prior neighbor who moved out due to her harassment, had accessed private property under false pretenses, and kept a binder full of unsolicited photographs she had taken of residents' homes, deliveries, and personal gatherings, something our legal team used to successfully argue for punitive damages on top of the compensatory ones, sending Karen into a full PR tailspin as the HOA scrambled to distance itself. The neighborhood turned against her, and she found herself the subject of not only civil suits, but an ongoing investigation into misuse of funds, all because she couldn't resist spraying bleach on a package that didn't belong to her. Packages that, had she taken 5 seconds to read the label, would have made her realize she was messing with something far beyond her understanding. And now, as I sit here watching the cleanup crew dismantle what's left of her once pristine garden, a court-ordered asset seizure to help pay toward the damages, I reflect not on revenge, but on the irony that all of this, lawsuits, investigations, her reputation in shambles, could have been avoided with a little respect, a little decency, and a spray bottle left in the damn garage. The aftermath of the bleach incident didn't just ripple. It crashed through the community like a tsunami tearing through a quiet seaside town. And as the lawsuit picked up steam, so did the attention, both in the neighborhood and beyond, with news vans now parked daily along the main cul-de-sac, their cameras trained on Karen's house like it was a scene from a crime documentary, while social media blew up with hashtags like bleach Karen and ho hellscape, drawing everyone from legal bloggers to automotive influencers to weigh in on the surreal nature of one woman's obsession with control gone so wildly off the rails. And while Karen tried to retreat behind closed blinds and her husband, a limp, quiet man who looked like he aged a decade in a week, shuffled around nervously trying to keep up appearances, the rest of the neighborhood was finally shaking off. The fog of her reign, gathering in front yards to swap stories, compare violation notices, and express disbelief over just how long they'd all put up with her antics. And for the first time in years, there was a sense of unity, not from shared HOA regulations, but from shared frustration with the petty tyranny they'd all lived under. Meanwhile, my legal team was working overtime, not only solidifying our case against Karen, but expanding it as more people came forward with their own tales of ruined landscaping, tampered mail, security camera footage of her trespassing, and, in one case, even pouring out birdseed because she claimed the birds were non-compliant wildlife. And each story, each photo, each documented complaint painted a picture not just of an overly zealous neighbor, but of a person so drunk on the illusion of authority that she believed the HOA bylaws gave her the right to override federal mail protection laws and private property rights. Something the district attorney's office took a very keen interest in once we submitted our compiled evidence, triggering a formal investigation into mail tampering and potential criminal charges, which sent Karen into a full meltdown, caught, on video of course, screaming at a process server on her porch and throwing a lawn gnome at his car, a clip that quickly made the rounds online and only amplified the public's fascination with the unraveling drama. But while the spectacle grew, I was still dealing with the real-world consequences of her actions. The Pebble Beach Committee had to be informed that my submission would not be completed, and while they were sympathetic, rules were rules, and the slot was given to a rival builder who'd been on the waiting list for 2 years, costing me not just my chance at national recognition, but an estimated $1.2 million in downstream commissions, parts licensing deals, and partnership opportunities that had hinged on my appearance at the event, which we added to the financial damage report my lawyers were preparing, pushing our claim into the multi-million-dollar range, an amount Karen could never dream of paying, even if she sold her house, her car, and the vintage coin collection. She tried to hide in a safety deposit box, which we discovered during asset disclosure, much to her horror. And as we closed in on the trial date, her attorney, a scrawny man with a thinning hairline and the charisma of cold oatmeal, offered a settlement so laughably low it only enraged us further, prompting my team to decline and move forward with full litigation, confident that not only would we win, but we'd establish a legal precedent strong enough to shake the foundations of HOA authority abuse across the country. And while all this unfolded, Karen's influence crumbled. Her former allies on the board resigned en masse to avoid being implicated. A special election was held to install a new, more balanced HOA leadership, and Karen's name was officially removed from all neighborhood correspondence and communications. A symbolic but satisfying gesture that marked the end of her informal dictatorship. But what truly drove home the shift in power was what happened during the first official HOA meeting after her removal, where nearly every resident showed up, some out of curiosity, others out of celebration, and when Karen attempted to attend, claiming she still had an advisory voice, she was denied entry by the newly elected president and the hired security detail, who handed her a restraining order, barring her from community events due to harassment claims filed by multiple neighbors, an action that sent her storming off, in tears, flanked by her bewildered husband who now wore the look of a man realizing he should have stepped in years ago. And while some might say that was enough, justice served, power dismantled, a tyrant toppled, I wasn't satisfied until every dollar of damage she caused was accounted for, every loss documented, and every consequence delivered. So we pushed forward with depositions, expert testimony, and forensic audits, all of which painted a damning picture that left the judge visibly appalled, prompting a series of court orders that not only froze her assets, but initiated a lien process on her property, effectively tying her entire financial future to the outcome of the trial. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, Karen doubled down, posting online rants, accusing me of orchestrating a neighborhood coup, even filing counterclaims that were so outlandish they were thrown out before reaching a hearing, including one where she accused me of engineering psychological warfare by intentionally placing suspicious packages in view to provoke her, a claim that not only made the judge audibly laugh during a pre-trial hearing, but further discredited her in the eyes of the court, leading to a motion for summary judgment that we filed with confidence and supporting affidavits from over 24 neighbors, each testifying to her pattern of harassment and boundary violations. And so, as the trial date loomed, the story was no longer just about a destroyed package. It was about the abuse of power, the illusion of authority, and what happens when the wrong person is given just enough influence to believe they're invincible, only to discover that the law, when wielded correctly, can be sharper than any bleach-soaked crusade. And as I prepared my own statement for the upcoming proceedings, I reflected not just on what I'd lost, but on what the neighborhood had gained: freedom from fear, a renewed sense of community, and the satisfaction of knowing that even the most deep-seated tyranny can be unraveled with patience, evidence, and a little help from a well-placed camera and a team of very good lawyers. The morning of the trial dawned gray and humid, with the kind of thick, suffocating tension in the air that mirrored the mood in the courtroom as I walked through the courthouse doors in a tailored navy suit, accompanied by my lead counsel, 2 associates, and a rolling briefcase stuffed with depositions, time-stamped photos, expert evaluations, and signed statements from nearly every household in the HOA, because this wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a reckoning, and Karen, dressed in a pale yellow blazer and trying to look like a misunderstood grandmother instead of a bleach-wielding tyrant, sat at the defendant's table flanked by a visibly exhausted legal team who looked like they knew they were marching into a firing squad. And once the proceedings began, the judge, an older, no-nonsense woman known for her sharp tongue and intolerance for frivolity, made it clear that she had reviewed the pretrial materials and found the situation highly unusual, noting that she couldn't recall the last time she had read so many separate declarations against a single defendant in a civil HOA case. And with that, our side launched into opening statements, outlining not only the financial destruction of the bespoke alloy, which had been chemically analyzed and confirmed as irreparably compromised, but the ripple effects that followed. Lost business opportunities, breach of contract penalties with my restoration partners, and the reputational damage of being unable to fulfill a promised entry at one of the most prestigious car events in the world. An entry that had already been promoted on posters, press kits, and social media, now permanently tied to an absence explained only by unforeseen sabotage, which might have sounded dramatic until the court was shown the doorbell cam footage of Karen marching across my driveway, muttering about unauthorized deliveries while holding a bleach bottle like a weapon, then methodically spraying every inch of the clearly marked container labeled with hazard warnings in 3 languages, a clip that played to dead silence in the courtroom save for one audible gasp from a jury member and the sound of Karen shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her face reddening as her lawyer scrambled to frame it as a concerned citizen's misguided attempt to ensure safety. But that excuse unraveled quickly when we followed up with the chain of emails and violation notices Karen had issued to other residents, including one where she threatened to fine a woman $500 for allowing her nephew to ride a scooter in the driveway, and another where she cited suspected mildew as grounds to enter a backyard uninvited with a pressure washer, a document trail that painted a portrait of someone obsessed with control, blind to boundaries, and entirely convinced she was above consequences. And then came the testimony. The elderly couple who'd been fined for using a non-HOA approved flagpole mount, the single mom who received a citation for having a soccer net visible from the street, and the retired veteran who revealed Karen had once reported his American flag as too large, each of them delivering their stories with quiet dignity and a hint of vindicated anger, their words carrying more weight than even we had anticipated. And when it came time for me to take the stand, I walked the jury through every step of what that delivery had meant. How rare the materials were, the uniqueness of the finish alloy process, the time sensitivity, the risks I had, mitigated with every layer of insulation, and how it all came crashing down in a matter of minutes because one person couldn't keep their bleach to themselves. And as I spoke, I could see the impact landing, jurors leaning forward, the judge nodding slowly, and Karen looking increasingly disoriented, like someone waking from a dream only to realize it's actually a nightmare, and her defense team's response was as limp as expected. They tried to argue that HOA authority granted her a degree of discretionary enforcement, but that backfired spectacularly when the judge cut them off mid-argument to say, even the HOA doesn't supersede federal law, especially not when it comes to tampering with private property. And with that, her legal footing collapsed like a poorly built shed in a hurricane, opening the door for our final witness, an alloy metallurgist flown in from Helsinki, who calmly explained with diagrams and chemical models how the bleach exposure had triggered a catalytic oxidation reaction that rendered the metal unstable, useless, and unrecoverable, essentially. Demonstrating that Karen hadn't just ruined a package, she'd annihilated something irreplaceable, one of only 3 known such alloys ever produced, and then came closing arguments where my lawyer delivered a speech so airtight and methodical it might as well have been chiseled from granite, concluding with the simple, devastating line, "What price do we place on years of work, of irreplaceable craftsmanship, of a man's livelihood? And how do we measure the arrogance of someone who thought bleach was stronger than the law?" A moment that hung in the air like the final note of a symphony, and then it was in the hands of the jury, who took only 4 hours to return a unanimous verdict in our favor, awarding not only full compensatory damages but an additional $3.5 million in punitive damages for malicious intent and systemic abuse of HOA authority, a decision that sent shockwaves not just through our community, but across the country as the case made headlines on major news outlets, legal analysis podcasts, and even a segment on a late-night comedy show that dubbed Karen the Queen of Clorox. And while the money couldn't restore the rare metal or reclaim the missed Pebble Beach opportunity, it allowed me to fund a new restoration project, rebuild my reputation, and create an independent foundation for automotive artisans to protect their intellectual and physical property against this kind of sabotage. A nonprofit that quickly attracted sponsorships and made Karen's name synonymous not with order, but with overreach, and in the weeks that followed, her house was listed for sale, though no one in the neighborhood wanted to buy it, and she disappeared, reportedly moving in with a distant cousin in Ohio, while our HOA board implemented sweeping reforms to restrict unilateral enforcement actions, require transparency in violation procedures, and permanently ban any single individual from serving more than 2 consecutive years, effectively closing the door on future Karens from gaining a similar stranglehold. And though many said the chapter was closed, I knew it wasn't quite over, not until the day I received a letter unmarked in shaky cursive, apologizing not for the bleach or the damage, but for letting things go too far. A half-hearted confession with no return address, postmarked from a small town in rural Ohio, and I stood there holding that letter in my garage, surrounded by gleaming chrome and engine parts, thinking of all that had been lost and all that had been rebuilt, knowing deep down that some people never change, but if nothing else, at least now, they know there's a price for pretending bleach is stronger than accountability. The months following the trial brought a kind of quiet triumph I hadn't expected. Not the explosive kind, not the type where confetti falls and crowds cheer, but the slow, steady kind that grows in silence, one small act of restoration at a time as I rebuilt not only my professional momentum, but my trust in the world around me, because living under someone like Karen had a way of warping your instincts, making you second-guess whether a package left on the porch would still be there in an hour, or whether planting tulips in the yard would somehow trigger a violation. And now, for the first time in years, neighbors were walking their dogs without fear of hidden fines, hosting small porch parties, putting up Halloween decorations without triple-checking the bylaws, and the HOA, under its new leadership, had shifted dramatically. Its meetings were no longer exercises in submission, but forums for collaboration, with residents actually showing up, speaking freely, and voting on real issues, rather than sitting through Karen's monologues about lawn symmetry and mailbox dimensions. And while her name was still whispered occasionally, mostly in stories that began with, "Remember when Karen," she had become a cautionary tale rather than a present threat. Her legacy reduced to a bitter chapter in the HOA's history, now being used in training seminars for new board members as a study in what not to do, and as for me, the settlement. Funds weren't just used to cover the cost of lost materials and business opportunities. I used them to open my own specialty auto restoration studio just outside the city, complete with reinforced package bays, temperature-controlled alloy, vaults, and a small showroom dedicated to the finish alloy that had sparked it all, where I mounted the bleach-stained, corroded remains of the original delivery on a plaque titled Property Damage Exhibit A, not out of spite, but as a warning and a reminder that vigilance, once forged in injustice, becomes a shield for others when channeled correctly. The studio became more than just a place to work. It was a hub for engineers, designers, mechanics, and dreamers, many of whom had followed the trial and reached out to say how Karen's actions had mirrored battles in their own neighborhoods, their own HOAs, their own struggles against overreach and ego, and I found myself mentoring, advising, sometimes even testifying in similar cases as expert witness, my story now a tool for justice rather than just a personal saga. And that transformation gave the entire ordeal meaning I hadn't expected. When I first found that soaked, ruined package on my doorstep, a moment that had felt like a door slamming shut but turned out to be the start of something far greater. Meanwhile, Karen, though no longer in the public eye, continued to cast a faint, acrid shadow from afar, popping up in obscure legal bulletins and HOA forums where her name was usually attached to a warning, and I occasionally heard rumors. That she had tried to join a new HOA board in Ohio and had been laughed out of the room, that she attempted to sue a neighbor for wind chimes being sonically aggressive and had the case dismissed with prejudice, that she was selling essential oils out of her garage and calling herself a freedom consultant. But those were all just stories, and I had no interest in confirming them because the truth was, she no longer mattered. She'd become a closed file in the cabinet of my life, one I could reference without reopening old wounds, and that was a piece I hadn't realized I needed until it arrived. Still, the universe has a wicked sense of humor, and it was about a year to the day from the trial verdict when something unexpected landed on my porch. Not a ruined package, but a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize addressed. To me, marked time-sensitive, and my heart stuttered for a moment as I imagined some final retaliatory twist. But when I opened it, what I found was stranger. A notice of bankruptcy court proceedings for Karen, who had apparently exhausted her assets paying off the judgment, attorney's fees, and various liens that had snowballed after the verdict. And while I could have taken that moment to gloat, to frame the letter next to the corroded alloy, or maybe even read it aloud during one of my shop's open houses, I didn't. Instead, I filed it away quietly, not out of pity, but out of resolve that I wouldn't let her infect another second of my life with her toxicity. And that decision, letting go completely, felt more powerful than any verdict ever could, and life moved on. The studio expanded, I hired my first apprentices, and I was finally invited back to Pebble Beach, not just as an exhibitor, but as a keynote speaker, to talk about craftsmanship, risk, and resilience. And when I stood on that stage overlooking a sea of vintage cars and reverent collectors, I shared the story not of Karen, but of the alloy, of its journey, of how sometimes the greatest trials in life aren't about recovering what was lost, but about discovering what you're truly made of in the aftermath. And the crowd applauded. Not because they pitied me, but because they understood that real strength is forged in moments of adversity, not comfort. I returned home to a community transformed, a neighborhood that had learned from the chaos, where the children rode scooters freely, where mail carriers no longer wore cautious expressions, and where neighbors now waved instead of whispering behind curtains. And as I stood on my porch one evening sipping coffee, I noticed a new family moving into what was once Karen's house. A couple with two small kids, putting up wind chimes and laughing while trying to untangle a hammock. And I smiled. Not because the house had new owners, but because the poison Karen had poured into the roots of our community had finally been flushed out, replaced with something real, something hopeful. And as the sun dipped below the rooflines of our cul-de-sac, I realized the full arc of what had happened. Not just justice served, but balance restored. A battle that had started with bleach and arrogance and ended with freedom, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that no matter how strong the bleach, some things, the truth, the law, and the will to stand tall, are stronger.